How you going everyone? This is the fourth devlog of my new game with the working title Wombatvania. Although I've actually changed direction since the footage from this devlog, so that name doesn't really make sense anymore, but I'll keep calling it that until I come up with a new one. So far I've done the basic movement and camera, made a few sprites and animations for the wombat and background, added a store and loadout, and started on some Metroidvania power-ups like swimming underwater and an in-air dash.
Cool.
As I said last time, this update was triggered by me finding out late that my game got accepted into a playtesting showcase in my city called Let's Break Games, hosted by Wajik, which at this point was under a week away.
Oops.
Yep. Again, I'm gonna have to implement immense amounts in mere moments, so let's get into it. Before adding the fly ability, I knew there were a few bugs that needed gently picking up and taking outside. There were many more as you can see here, but I'll just talk about the ones I actually recorded. With the new more floaty jump that I'd made, I noticed that after hitting their head, the character would kind of stick to the ceiling for a bit, like a poorly flipped pancake.
Like a what?
I don't know. I just needed to stop the character from continuing to jump once they've hit their head, so I came up with this kind of hacky solution where the jump timer would be reset to 0 if the character's Y velocity was near 0 in midair. This could be a problem later on, but it's working well enough for now, so I'll count it as a win.
Cutting corners.
Oh, well, anyway, this other thing was happening where the character's state would rapidly transition between grounded and in air when moving. It's hard to tell from the output itself, but you can see from this number that it did it 14 times in a few seconds. Up close you can kind of see what's happening. The wombat slowly rises up until the ground checking hitbox is in the air, then hits the dirt like it's dodging magpies in spring. I'd previously set it up so that gravity didn't affect the wombat while it was grounded to avoid it getting stuck in the gaps between tiles. But that was just from before I implemented a sprite atlas to fix that. Anyway, that meant that the small inconsistencies in Unity's collision checking would slightly push the character up a little, allowing it to float up until it was officially in the air, at which point gravity would kick in and the cycle would start over again. Or since we're in Australia, it probably looks more like this.
Haha, what a funny joke.
I just thought that people from like the US and other countries...
Because we're upside down, right?
Yes.
Hilarious.
I just changed it so that gravity now affects the character while they're grounded, and the problem cleared up.
What, really? All that and you just turned gravity back on?
How many times do I have to tell you not to talk to me while I then decided to completely redo the camera so I could easily set its state depending on the character's current state and currently equipped ability. This strange thing was happening though, where the camera would move in this jerky way. The problem was that the character's position was being checked every frame update, but the camera's position was being set every physics update, which occurs at a lower fixed frequency. I changed it so that the positions were being checked and set in the fixed update method, but it still meant that the camera was moving at a lower frame rate, which made it a little hard to look at.
Ouch.
Though I actually reckon most of that was me having too many programs open at once on my trusty 2018 HP Pavilion laptop that sounded like a jet engine at the best of times. After some suggestions online, I moved the camera's update code to the late update method, but I couldn't tell how much that actually changed anything given my trusty jet engine laptop.
It looks exactly the same.
I ended up with this. Each update, the camera will move its target X position to a set distance in front of the character, and its target Y position to the character's Y position if they're not in midair. This is so the camera doesn't try to follow the wombat upwards every time the player jumps, but I'll have to add more nuances for situations like if the little larrikin jumps down from a higher ledge.
Oh.
Anyway, also on every frame, the camera sets its current speed according to how far it is from its target position, and moves its current position a distance towards its target position according to that speed. This is what it ended up looking like at the time. I also made it so the camera wouldn't follow the character while they were dashing to try and sell the burst of forwards movement. You could hardly tell it was even happening here, but I was just happy to be able to set different modes for the camera. And hey, if you're liking the video so far, why don't you subscribe for more like it? Okay, it's time to actually add the flying mechanic into the game.
Finally!
I felt like the game needed to have at least 3 movement mechanics to actually feel like a Metroidvania in time for the playtesting event. I started by making Fly just immediately apply a small upwards force to the character for a small set amount of time. Since the character kept its current Y velocity when they started flying, the height they reached was inconsistent, meaning that pressing Fly when moving downwards hardly made the character fly at all. But pressing it when going upwards made them fly up rapidly, like Perth's rental market. Just a little local humour there. Anyway, I'll have to do something about that inconsistency.
Just do it then.
I literally just started
saying, actions speak louder than 1,000 words.
What? No, you're mixing your metaphors. A picture is worth 1,000.
Just fix the flying thing.
Fine. I made it so the character's Y velocity is immediately halted just before applying the upwards force to make the flight much more consistent. Although just like with the dash mechanic, I eventually made it so the character's Y velocity would instead slow to 0 before boosting upwards to smooth the transition. Also like with the dash component, I made it so I could change the values in the editor.
Wow, who would have thunk it?
Look, I'm just asking that you...
I'm hungry.
What? How is that my No. No, I'm not doing this with you right now. There was still the problem with the fly mechanic's horizontal movement, since the player could easily get to areas that should only be accessible with the dash mechanic. I needed to come up with a way to make it so the character couldn't move past a certain X distance when flying. Are you... Fine, I'll make you some brekkie. Let me just start this. This was the iterative process of the fly mechanic. This is the character's jump with no abilities equipped. With it equipped, the fly mechanic can be used anytime the character is in the air. At this point, they jump, load up, fly, then drop. It looks like this all together. But this means that the fly ability has such a long horizontal clearance that it kinda negates the need for the dash ability. You could technically make it to a far platform that should only be accessible with a dash. So I wanted the character not to be able to leave some X distance from their X position when they started using the flight mechanic. I made it so that when the flight mechanic is activated, the X position of the character is stored and an invisible boundary is created around that position. This did stop the far horizontal movement, but it was very obvious when the character hit the invisible boundary, which just looked and felt bad. I left the boundary there so the character couldn't cross it, but I also made it so the character's maximum X velocity would instead slow to 0 when approaching the boundary. This is before and after slowing the character's X velocity. The boundary is no longer so obvious and the character can't make it to the far platform. I then realised that setting the boundary depending on when the ability is used adds unnecessary variables to each flight, and forces the player to use the ability at the exact optimal moment in their jump to get the full distance. So for consistency, I made it so the boundary would instead be set every time the character leaves the ground, and made it wider than before. This also helped hide the invisible boundary further, since the character is now slowed down over a longer distance. I also added a maximum height to the flight mechanic to override the maximum flight time for more height consistency. The character now can't make it to the far platform, and the flight's distance and height are consistent. The problem now was that the whole point of the flight mechanic was to get up to high places like this one, but with the invisible boundary you often couldn't move enough after flying to actually make it onto the higher ledge, which just feels bad when you're right there. I decided to add a hover to the end of the flight to fix this. Once the flight timer ends, the boundary is removed and a small upwards force is applied to hold the character for a little before dropping them. The whole process now is jump, load up, fly up within the boundary, hover out of the boundary, and drop. It looks like this all together. This worked pretty well for now, and after typing in a few random words and numbers, the code looked like this.
Huh? Random words and numbers?
Okay, I'm glad you're feeling better now that you're reading something, but please try not to talk with your mouth full.
Just keep going.
The use method in the fly component is triggered by pressing the use ability button. It transitions the character to the flying state and calls the start flying method, which starts the load up, fly, and hover timers for the flying state to use. The flying state class itself then handles the actual flying. It first loads up for the flight, boosts the character upwards, and sets the character's X velocity according to their proximity to the boundary. It then applies a small amount of upwards force to hover the character for a bit, and returns the player's horizontal controls before transitioning the character back to the in-air state and letting them plummet to the ground like a swooping magpie.
Another magpie simile? How original.
And it looked like this in the game at that point. I eventually tweaked it a bit later on, but it was working pretty well for now, and I knew I had a lot of back-end stuff to do before the showcase. I played around with the different abilities to try and break them, like a New Year's resolution in January.
Nope. Try again.
I came across this exploit where you could use the dash ability to get as high as you can with the fly ability. And another exploit where you could use the fly ability to get as far as you can with the dash ability. I'll probably have to tweak the values a little, but these are also just things I'll have to keep in mind when designing the level. Why are you doing that again?
How much longer is this gonna go for?
Okay, whatever. That's all for this update. I really appreciate all the encouraging comments, by the way. Make sure to comment any cool ideas or tips you might have for me. In the next one I have even less time to do even more stuff and end up having a few all-nighters drawing and adding art for the 3 new abilities, drawing a heap more ground and background tiles, basic art for a workshop, tweaking the current abilities, adding a pushable block which will be a core puzzle mechanic, updating the workshop and loadout scenes, adding some particle effects, designing and creating a whole new level, and making sure that before the showcase event, all the bugs were gently picked up and taken outside.
Spoiler alert, they weren't.
Yep, thanks. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and the development process so far. See ya folks.
Bye.
Have a good one.